Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to another episode of How to Play Warhammer 40k 8th edition. This is going to be a very important tutorial because here we are going to talk about the charge phase and the fight phase. We are going to lump these together because of how much they interact. I really want to make sure that we do this right. I have to give you a warning though, the charge and fight phase are probably the most important phases for you to learn how to do properly, especially if you are coming from a previous edition of Warhammer 40k, because they work totally differently now. Also, on the surface, they may appear to be simple, but there's actually a lot of nuances that allow you to do certain things, like tying up units without worrying about Overwatch, or multi-charging or charging through guys to get to other guys. There's a lot of things that can come up because of all of this. So you need to really pay attention and make sure that when you actually do your charges, and your pile-ins and your consolidates, that you follow word for word the rules that are in the rule book. There's also a couple of wonky situations that might appear to be unusual, but actually are quite common and will happen all the time, and you need to plan for them, both in how you place your guys, as well as how you are going to charge in. Now this might sound more like tactics, but it's actually really important that you understand all the ways that this interacts. Otherwise, you will have a very hard time when it comes to close combat. As is usual, we have a battle report for you as well after this is done in the link in the video description below. It's going to focus on the close combat phase. We're going to make sure that both armies have a lot of close combat, so they'll both be doing charges and lots of piling ins and fighting. And so you can see exactly how it works, because it has changed a lot from previous editions. And of course, if you're new to Warhammer 40k, then you've got nothing to base it on, so you got to make sure you do it right, because a lot of assumptions you might have will probably be wrong on how all of this works. And so watch that battle report after this so you can really see how it works. If you're not a Vault member, you can still click it, get a 7-day free trial to watch it as well. And of course, we would love for you to share this video series with anybody else who is looking to learn how to play 40k 8th edition. Just tell them to go to miniwargaming.com/how-to-play-40k. Let's take a look. Let's start with the charge phase, which is probably the simpler of the two and yet still has its own nuances. In the charge phase, the player whose turn it is able to select units to charge with. Now the restrictions for this are that you must select a unit who has not advanced or fallen back, or one that is already within an inch of an enemy unit. So if they're already within an inch of an enemy unit, you can kind of consider them engaged in close combat already, so they're not allowed to charge away or charge into it. And you also have to choose a unit who has at least one enemy unit within 12 inches of them. And so even though you can technically make a charge against a unit that is more than 12 inches away from you, you cannot declare that charge. The reason for this is in order to complete a charge, all you have to do is move one model to within an inch of an enemy model. So you don't have to get in base contact. That means if they were 12.5 inches away and you had a 12-inch charge, you technically would complete that charge. But since they started more than 12 inches away, you can't even declare that charge to begin with. You may also have things that give you bonuses to your charge distance, but it doesn't matter. If they are more than 12 inches away, you cannot choose them as a target. So in this one, we're going to do the example of this Intercessor Squad, the Primaris Space Marines. That is going to be that's the unit that we're going to choose to charge with first. The second part is that you choose your target. So once you've chosen the unit that's charging, you select one or more enemy units within 12 inches of them as the target or targets of the charge. So in this case, let's have some fun. Let's say that the Intercessors want to charge the Poxwalkers and the Plague Marines. We're not going to talk about whether that's good tactics or not. We're just going to say that's what we decided to do. Each target unit, before we do our charge move, which is a random move as you're going to see, is allowed to fire Overwatch. Now Overwatch is an out-of-sequence shooting attack that works just like all the shooting rules we talked about in the shooting phase, with a couple of exceptions. One is that they always hit on sixes. It doesn't matter what your ballistic skill is, it doesn't matter what modifiers are applied, you only hit on sixes irrespective of anything else that's going on. Unless you have a special rule that says in Overwatch you do better than that. But you just hit on sixes. So you could be shooting at a unit that has -3 to hit. If you shoot at them, you could have a ballistic skill of 2+. It doesn't matter. You hit on sixes. And the other thing is, now this is an interesting one that comes up. Let's say that we're reversing this for a second, and this the Plague Caster has decided to charge the Primaris Marines. Well, since he's declared them as the target of his charge, they can fire at him even though he is not closer than the nearest enemy unit. The reason for this is simply because the beginning of the paragraph under Overwatch, it says each time a charge is declared against a unit, the target unit can immediately fire Overwatch at the would-be attacker. So that overrides our rule saying that you would not be able to fire at the character because he is not the closest enemy. So you can't use a character to eat up the Overwatch. The only other restriction to Overwatch is if you are already within an inch of an enemy, then they cannot declare Overwatch against you. So for example, let's say these Plague Marines were already within an inch of these Inceptors, and then the Intercessors declared a charge against them. They could not fire Overwatch because they're already within an inch of an enemy. In other words, they're already engaged in close combat. On the contrary, let's say the Inceptors declared a charge against the Plague Marines, and let's say the Plague Marines did their Overwatch and either killed all the Inceptors or the Inceptors failed to make their charge. When the Intercessors then declare a charge, they can fire Overwatch again. So you can fire Overwatch as many times as you are declared the target of a charge, as long as you are not already engaged in close combat or have an enemy within an inch of you. After you have resolved the effects of Overwatch, which is done just like shooting, so we won't go over all the rules for that here, you would then make your charge move. Now for most, you just roll 2d6. You just assume, unless they have their own special rule, that you just roll 2d6, and that is how far the unit is allowed to charge. Now I'm going to change that die roll because I didn't really like it. Let's say that I actually rolled a 6. So I'm allowed to move 6 inches. Now how you charge is very important. When you move the first model, he can move up to that distance. He does not have to move the full distance, so he has control over that, but he must end within an inch of a model from a unit that he declared a charge from. He must also stay more than an inch away from any models that in the units that he did not declare charges against. And if he is unable to do this, then the charge fails and nobody moves. So that original 3 inches that I rolled, that actually would have been a successful charge, because if I moved 3 inches, I would be within an inch of this Poxwalker. But if I rolled a double 1 in this case, that 2 inches would not get me within an inch of the Poxwalkers, and so the whole charging unit would not move at all. They don't move the 2 inches and stop. They don't move at all. So we'll go back to that 6-inch charge. Let's make it a double 3 here. So with this, I choose any model from this unit, and he must move into within 1 inch of an enemy. So I'm going to choose this guy out front, and we'll move him up to here. You'll notice that I actually put him within an inch of both of these, but I didn't put him in base contact. It's because I don't actually have to put him in base contact in order to do that. I then, with the rest of the models, move them however I like, as long as they don't move more than the 6 inches that I rolled. They don't come within an inch of an enemy that I did not declare a charge against, and they end in unit coherency. So if I wanted to, I could charge them like this. There's not really much reason to not keep them in combat, but I could technically do that. More likely, I would charge them in and try to put guys to fight whichever squads I really want to fight. Once again, we're not talking about tactics here. We're just talking about how the rules work. And that right there is a successful charge. Now there's two more things I want to talk about here. One is heroic intervention. Any characters, after the enemy has completed all of their charge moves, so if I wanted to then move on to another unit and charge, move to another unit and charge, once I said all my charges are done, then any of the characters that are within 3 inches of an enemy unit may perform a heroic intervention. So this Plaguecaster, for example, is a character, and he's within 3 inches of that Intercessor unit. So what he can do, if he wants to, is he can move up to 3 inches so long as he ends his move closer to the nearest enemy model. So if I want to move 3 inches with him, I can't go like this and be like, okay, I'm out of here. It's a heroic intervention, not a heroic falling back. So I could move up. I don't actually even have to end within an inch of the enemy. I could just move up a little bit. But usually you're going to use this to jump into the combat in order to fight him. You don't have to do it, but some characters love being in combat. And so they'll start behind other guys who will screen them from being shot at. And when the enemy charges in and doesn't want to engage him, sometimes they're forced to get close enough to him, and so he'll charge into the combat as well. So that's very important right there. The other thing is, remember that in this case, it does not give any restrictions to charging characters. I could declare this character a target of my charge, even though he is not closer than the nearest visible enemy unit. That is only a restriction for shooting. However, if I wanted to charge into this character, you'll notice that I have to get within an inch of both of these squads, which means the only way that I could do that is if I declare a charge against them as well. So I'd have to do a multi-charge. So I'd have to be like, okay, I want to get to him, so I'm going to declare a charge against him, the Poxwalkers, and the Plague Marines. Now that allows you to get in, but it also allows your opponent to get more Overwatch. Now if he had positioned his guys like this, then I could declare a charge against him all I like, but I will not be able to get to him because there is no space for my base to go through. I cannot pass through models in the charge phase without having the fly keyword. And so it's important both as the defender over here that if I don't want him to be able to get to me, that I close those gaps. And it's also important as the attacker that if I want to get to him, I have to make sure that I declare the appropriate charges, that I do not get within an inch of anybody who I have not charged, so that he has the maximum benefit of all of his Overwatch as well. Who you also declare charges against is very important, as you're going to find out in the fight phase, because when you charge, you can only attack those that you declared charges against. So for example, let's say I did not declare the charge against that character and I had charged him just like before, and then he does his heroic intervention. In the fight phase, as you're going to see, is he'll be allowed to fight. But they'll get to fight first because they charged. But they will not be able to attack him because they did not declare him a target of their charge. So it's very important. Remember that when you charge, you can only attack those who you declare a charge against. So get used to multi-charges because you're going to be doing a lot of them. That's really all there is to the charge phase. So let's jump now into the fight phase. For this example, for the fight phase, we are going to assume that these intercessors were already in combat at the beginning of this turn. In other words, they did not charge this turn. And that we're going to assume that these inceptors actually did charge this turn. And so this is an ongoing fight, and these guys charged this turn. So in the fight phase, we go through our fight sequence. We choose a unit to fight with. They get to pile in up to 3 inches. They choose their targets. They attack. They resolve their close combat attacks, which works very much like shooting, except you're using your close combat weapons. And then you can consolidate again up to 3 inches. Now, when you declare who is going to be fighting, you start first with all of your chargers. So you're going to find that this is alternate activation where I choose a unit to fight with and then my opponent chooses one. And then I choose one and my opponent chooses one until they are all done. No unit can ever be chosen more than once, and chargers always go first. So if everybody in my army charged, I would actually get to attack with everybody in my army before my opponent even got to swing back. That is a pretty big deal. It means that when you get those multi-charges off and you get lots of guys charging, you get to do massive damage before your opponent even gets a strike back. So let's start with the inceptors. We actually have to because they charged. So the first thing that you do is you choose the unit, which we did. We then pile in. Now pile in and consolidating work exactly the same. They are actually copy and paste the same paragraph in the rule book. So get this right because it does not always work the way you think it'll work. When you pile in, you may move each model in the unit up to 3 inches. This can be anywhere as long as the model ends the move closer to the nearest enemy model. And obviously stays in coherency. That's always a subtext that you have to remember. So for example, this inceptor right here wants to move 3 inches. The closest, actually let's move them a tiny bit like this. So it's obvious that the closest enemy model is going to be this Plague Marine. Well, when he moves at 3 inches, he can actually move 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches, but he has to end closer to this guy. So before he was over here, now he's over there, but you can see now his base is closer. And then this guy could move, well, we've got to maintain coherency. Right now he's this far away, and now he's going to be that far away from him, and we're back to unit coherency. So this is really important because maybe we have, let's show an example of how this can really mess up your opponent. Maybe we have this guy who, let's say he does not want to be in combat. Now in this case, this guy loves combat, so you wouldn't want to do this. But let's pretend that he is a really squishy character that is just back there to give support and give buffs to everybody and make them better. Well, I charged these guys, but what I could do in my pile-in is I can pile in to 3 inches, and I can get within an inch of him, engaging him in the combat as well. Now, since they charged this turn, and since they only declared the Plague Marines as their charge, they will not be able to swing and attack this character. But if he really does suck in close combat, and maybe he would have been really good at shooting or something, this could be a tank. This could be, it could be a really good shooty unit that wants to shoot, but by engaging them, all of a sudden you don't have to worry about that. On top of that, they don't get to Overwatch, even though it really feels like they should be able to because, hey, you just charged me. You didn't charge them. You just piled in and happened to get closer to that model. So this guy should be over here, just to make that correct. So they would pile in there. They would make their attacks. Now, to do your attacks, you choose your targets. If you have multiple attacks, you can split them up between the different targets. You're allowed to fight any unit where you have a model within an inch of that unit, or you're within an inch of a guy who's within an inch. Like for example, if we were like this Inceptor is within an inch of the squad, and this Inceptor is within an inch of a guy who is within an inch of the squad. So he is allowed to target them as well. But we'll put him back over here. And then they make their attacks. So when you do your attacks, you divide them up however you want. So if I could attack him, I could put some attacks on him and on them, but I can't because I charged them. I choose my melee weapon. Melee weapons have the same profile as shooting weapons, except their range and type will say melee rather than 12-inch range, and type is rapid fire. And that specifies that it can only be used in close combat. And the strength, the AP, the damage all work the same. A lot of the melee weapons will say strength user or strength user times 2 or strength user plus 2. All that means is it uses the strength on the profile in the data slate, modified however it says. If you do not have any melee weapons, like the Inceptors, for example, under their weapons don't have anything listed, you assume that they have a basic melee weapon called a close combat weapon, which is just the strength of the user, has no AP, and it does 1 damage. So that's actually the case of the Inceptors. They do not have any melee weapons listed, so they just fight at their strength 4 with no AP and with 1 damage apiece. After we've allocated where we're going to be doing our attacks, in this case I'm going to say all my attacks will be on the Plague Marines, we then roll our attack dice. The number of attack dice that you roll is based on your attack characteristic. Now this Inceptor squad, what's left of it at least, has an Inceptor and a Sergeant. The Inceptor has 2 attacks and the Sergeant has 3. So between the two of them we have 5 attacks. I can roll these all together simply because they both have the same stats, they have the same weapon skill, and they're using the same type of weapon. So we don't really have to roll them all separately. They have a weapon skill of 3+. Now just like in shooting, it works exactly like shooting, except instead of the ballistic skill you look at the weapon skill. So these guys have a weapon skill of 3+, so we'd roll to hit. Now we've got 3 hits because the 1 and the 2 are misses. We then look at the strength of the weapon, which in this case is 4, against the toughness of the opponent, which in this case is 5. Just like in the shooting phase, if we look at the differences and we consult the chart, when we see that the toughness is higher than the strength, then we get a 5 to wound. We roll to wound. In this case we get 1 wound, and then we move on. We allocate the wound, so the opponent says, you know what, I want to put it on this guy. He's got a 3-up save, so I get to roll my armor save. Now the close combat weapon from these guys does not modify the armor save, so I would just roll my normal armor save. Now in this case he failed it, and just like before, these guys have the disgustingly resilient rule that says whenever they lose a wound, they can pretty much ignore it on a 5 or a 6. So in this case, now that he failed to save, we apply the damage. The damage is 1, which means he'll lose 1 wound, which means we roll 1 die, and if we roll a 5+, which we don't, then he dies. He is slain because he only has 1 wound. And that's it. And after that is done, then these models can do a consolidation move, which works exactly the same as a pile-in, which is move 3 inches. Now, if you're in base contact with an enemy, you cannot pile in nor can you consolidate, because there is no way that you can move in such a way that you end closer to the enemy model. So you must just stay where you are. But let's say I had gotten really lucky and I killed 2 guys, and my opponent decided that he wanted to kill these 2. Well, then at the consolidation, I have to move 3 inches, but I have to end closer to the nearest enemy model. So this guy, the nearest model is that Lord, but I could pile in like this. So I end closer to him. And for him, it looks like it's this guy. So I'll pile in right here and end closer to him, so I stay locked in that combat. You never actually have to pile in, nor do you have to consolidate. It's just usually a good idea if you're a close combat squad to do so, because it allows you to get further into the action and make sure they don't run away and shoot you. But you actually never have to. You may pile in, and you may consolidate. So after all the chargers have gone, the person whose turn it is then chooses a unit to attack with. So since it's a Space Marine turn, I would choose this group of Marines. So even though they did not charge, they would actually go first before everybody else because it is a Space Marine's turn. So after all the chargers are done, the Space Marine player gets to go first in picking somebody. In a much larger game, you'll see several close combats going across the table, and so you'll see them going back and forth a lot more, but this is just like the Space Marines all get to go first. So the next thing I would do is I would choose these 5 guys. I would choose their targets. Now in this case, this guy, I want to put as many attacks on these Plague Marines as I can. Well, this guy is within an inch of them, so even though he's closer to him, I can actually allocate attacks onto them from him. So he'll attack them, and he is within an inch of a guy within an inch of the Plague Marines. So all 3 of these can actually allocate attacks over here. Even though he's closer to there, as long as I follow the rules that I can only attack somebody who is within an inch of me, or within an inch of somebody who is within an inch, then we're fine. So I'll put these 3 on the Plague Marines, and then these 2s over onto the Voxwalkers. Oh no, the Poxwalkers. Thank you, Poxwalkers. And then I'll resolve the attacks. First off, I can pile in, of course. So if I wanted to pile in, however I want to, as long as I follow the rules of ending closer to that model than I started, then that's fine. Then I can do my attacks just like normal. And then after they are done and the casualties have been removed, then the Death Guard player would get to choose 1 squad to fight back with. He could actually choose this Lord of Contagion, because he's within an inch. So the units that you can choose, there's 2 rules that you have to follow, or one of 2 rules you have to follow when choosing units to fight in close combat. 1, they have to have charged, or 2, they have to already be within an inch of an enemy. So if this Lord of Contagion was here, I could not select him because he's not within an inch of an enemy. However, let's say these Inceptors and these Space Marines all charged in, and the Space Marines put their attacks onto the Death Guard, and all of them died. I got super lucky. These Inceptors are no longer within an inch of an enemy, but because they charged, they can still be chosen, and they'll be able to do their pile-in and their consolidate as well. But they still are restricted to only fighting people that they declared charges against. So if they had not declared charges against these guys, yes, they could pile into them, but they would not be able to then attack them. So there's a lot of little nuances. Make sure the first 10 games you play that you read and you reread the charge phase and the fight phase to make sure you're doing it right. Remember, pile-ins and consolidates, all of this happens before you move on to the next unit. I'd say the biggest surprises that people have when they watch this, and the thing that they actually don't like at first, until you get used to how much of a tactic it is the fact that you can engage guys that you did not charge. So if we look at the converse, and we bring over a couple Devastators right here, and they don't want to get engaged in combat, they want to be able to fire. And then these Plague Marines, let's say it's like this, the Plague Marines charge into these Marines, but they don't charge them because they don't want to get the Overwatch. Well, then this one could pile in 3 inches. As long as he gets closer to him, he can move over to here. He got closer to him, he moved 3 inches, and now he moved within an inch of them. And then this one just can move right here. I'm assuming that guy's closer. And now they're engaged in combat. I won't be able to strike them with attacks, but now I've brought them into the combat. So on their turn, if these guys are still alive, they won't be able to fire their last cannons, which is a really, really important tactic. It works even better against vehicles because it's really annoying when a vehicle can't just fire all of its heavy weaponry, and vehicles typically aren't that good in close combat. But it's actually used a lot in the game, so first when you see it, you might not like it, but just get used to it because it is a big part of the charge and fight phase in Warhammer 40k 8th edition. That's it for the charge and the fight phase. And we'll cover the morale phase in a separate video, but we'll lump it in with a bunch of other things because the morale phase is actually pretty straightforward and pretty simple. So maybe we'll talk about that with transports and all of that. The charge and fight phase, once you get them down, it'll be a piece of cake. At first, it can be a little daunting because there's a lot of little interactions. When you're a total beginner, you probably won't even notice a lot of those interactions, but the more you play, the more you'll realize just what you can do with your charges and with your pile-ins and with your consolidates. There's all sorts of nuances about killing a unit and then consolidating towards the next unit to keep them locked up in combat. But then all the things you have to think about, whether they'll actually be able to strike you back before you have a chance to hit them. Lots of tactics there. Just get used to how it works. The battle report below is going to actually have a really good game with lots of charges and pile-ins and consolidates so you can see how it all interacts together. So go and watch that right now. And of course, make sure you tell everybody else about this. If they want to learn how to play Warhammer 40k 8th edition, tell them to go to MiniWarGaming.com/howtoplay40k. Thanks for watching. Happy wargaming.